The millionaire, desperate as his twin daughters wouldn't stop crying, watches as his own daughter, the housekeeper, calms them with a song. The young woman's simple melody brings an unexpected wave of relief, instantly soothing the babies and changing the entire feel of the room. He realizes that true power isn't found in expensive solutions, but in the genuine love and affection from someone who truly cares. If this beautiful story of resilience and love moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments. And now to continue the story. Tuesday morning arrived like every other for the past 2 months, with the desperate sound of the twins crying echoing through the halls of the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Edward Montgomery rose from the leather armchair where he had dozed for only 40 minutes, the most he'd managed since Isabella and Helena were born. His eyes were red, swollen with the exhaustion and despair that grew with each passing day. The 42-year-old businessman, owner of one of the largest development companies in New York State, never imagined that his fortune of over $200 million would be utterly useless against 2 3-month-old babies who simply couldn't find peace. He had spent nearly $500,000 in the last 2 months alone trying to find out what was afflicting his daughters. The best pediatricians in New York City, renowned neurologists from New York Presbyterian Hospital, even specialists flown in from overseas. They all left his house with the same look of helplessness, shaking their heads and muttering about severe colic, possible allergies, or simply a difficult temperament. Edward walked barefoot across the Carrara marble floor to the girls' room on the 2nd floor of the mansion. The house was 65,000 square feet with 15 rooms, an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the backyard, and a view of the Long Island Sound. But none of that mattered when his daughters had been crying non-stop since 5 o'clock the previous afternoon. The sound of his footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase, mingling with the sobs coming from the twins' room. When he opened the door, he found the nurse, Carmen, RN, trying to soothe Isabella while Helena screamed in the adjacent crib. The 50-year-old woman, a graduate of Columbia University's nursing school and a specialist in neonatal care, looked just as exhausted as he was. Carmen looked at Edward with an expression that mixed frustration and pity. She had worked with hundreds of babies over her 20-year career, but she had never encountered 2 children so agitated. It was as if they were trapped in an endless cycle of anguish that no medical care or soothing technique could break. Edward picked up Helena, feeling his daughter's tiny body tremble from crying so hard. She had lost almost a pound since birth, even on the formula recommended by the specialists. Isabella was also below her ideal weight. The pediatrician, Dr. Miller, had warned that if the situation didn't improve soon, the girls would need to be hospitalized for more extensive testing. The anguish eating away at Edward went far beyond physical exhaustion. He felt like a failure as a father. When his wife, Laura, died in childbirth due to unforeseen complications, he had promised her and himself that he would be the best father possible. Laura had always dreamed of being a mother, and they had tried to conceive for 4 years before she finally got pregnant. The day they found out they were expecting twins was the happiest of their lives. Now, 2 months after losing her, Edward felt he was betraying that promise every single day. Sitting in the armchair in the girls' room, rocking Helena while Carmen tried to calm Isabella, Edward closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of Laura's voice humming during her pregnancy. She had a habit of stroking her belly and singing softly, especially on nights when the babies were more active in the womb. Laura used to say they were already showing their strong personalities and that she knew they would be determined women just like her. The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on Edward. Laura had died trying to bring these 2 lives into the world, and now he couldn't even provide them with the most basic of comforts, a peaceful night's sleep. During the lonely early hours, he would talk to his wife's photo on the nightstand, asking for forgiveness and begging for a sign on how to care for their daughters. It was around 4 in the morning when Edward heard soft footsteps in the hallway. At first, he thought it was Carmen going to get another bottle or change the girls' diapers, but the steps were different, more delicate. The door opened slowly, and the worried face of Rosa Diaz, the 32-year-old woman who had been working in the house for only 3 months, appeared. Rosa had been hired 2 weeks before the twins were born, when Laura was still alive, and making the final preparations for her daughter's arrival. She had come from a small town in South Texas, seeking a better life in the big city. She had left behind a history of loss and disillusionment that Edward knew nothing about. The woman entered the room hesitantly, clearly embarrassed to be intruding on an intimate family moment, but unable to ignore the suffering she heard from the kitchen, where she was preparing the first bottle of the day. Edward looked at her in surprise. Rosa had always been discreet, carrying out her domestic duties without ever interfering in the girl's care. She cleaned the house impeccably, cooked simple but tasty meals, and remained almost invisible during the times when doctors and specialists visited the mansion. Edward had barely spoken to her beyond basic instructions about how the house worked. Rosa approached timidly, her work-worn hands clasped in front of her. She wore a simple navy blue uniform that Laura had chosen, and her brown hair was tied back in a low bun. There was something in her dark eyes that Edward couldn't quite decipher, a depth that suggested difficult experiences, but also a genuine tenderness. "Excuse me for bothering you, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice soft with a gentle southern drawl, "but I couldn't sleep hearing the girls like this. Would you let me try something?" Edward hesitated. Carmen gave him a look that said she saw no harm in letting the housekeeper try since nothing else was working. He nodded, curious and desperate, enough to accept any suggestion. Rosa approached Isabella, who was in Carmen's arms, and held out her hands. The nurse carefully handed the baby over, and something inexplicable happened the moment Rosa held the child. Isabella didn't stop crying immediately, but there was a subtle shift in her agitation, as if she sensed something different in this woman's touch. Edward watched, fascinated, as Rosa began to rock Isabella with smooth, natural movements. There was no formal technique to her gestures, none of the methods Carmen had learned in college, or that the specialists had recommended. It was something instinctive, as if she knew exactly what the baby needed. And then Rosa began to sing. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a melody Edward had never heard before. It wasn't a traditional children's song or a lullaby he recognized. It was something that seemed to come from far away, perhaps from a lost childhood in rural Texas, or from memories Rosa kept locked deep in her heart. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Isabella began to relax in Rosa's arms, her sobs lessening in intensity. Helena, whom Edward was still holding, also seemed to be affected by the soft voice that filled the room. The desperate crying gave way to calmer breathing, and for the first time in weeks, Edward felt something like hope. Carmen watched the scene with an expression of someone witnessing the impossible. In her entire career, she had seen difficult cases, babies with severe colic, children who seemed inconsolable, but she had never witnessed such a rapid and inexplicable transformation. Rosa continued to sing as she walked around the room, holding Isabella against her chest. The lyrics of the song were in Spanish, but there was something in it that transcended words. It was as if she were transmitting something through the melody, an ancient calm that spoke directly to the babies' hearts. Edward found himself enveloped by the same peace that seemed to be calming his daughters. For the first time in 2 months, he felt his shoulders relax and his breathing deepen. Helena was asleep in his arms, and when he looked at Isabella, he saw that she too had closed her eyes and was breathing peacefully in Rosa's lap. The silence that followed was the most profound the mansion had known since the twins' birth. Rosa continued to hum softly for a few more minutes before stopping completely. She looked at Edward with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by what had just happened. "They're sleeping," Carmen whispered, barely believing what she was seeing. Edward nodded, unable to speak. Something was happening here that he couldn't explain with logic or reason. A simple woman, a housekeeper he barely knew, had achieved in 20 minutes what the best specialists in the country couldn't in 2 months. Rosa gently placed Isabella in her crib, and Edward did the same with Helena. The 2 babies were sleeping soundly, their expressions for the first time peaceful and serene. Edward backed away from the cribs carefully, as if any sudden movement might break the spell. In the hallway, away from the girls' room, Edward finally found his voice. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Rosa looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't know how to explain it, Mr. Montgomery. I just felt that they needed comfort, someone who understood their pain." "Their pain?" Edward repeated, confused. Rosa hesitated before answering, as if deciding how much of herself she could reveal. "Sometimes babies feel things we don't understand. Mr. Montgomery, they feel when something is missing, when the heart of the person caring for them is broken." Rosa's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He had spent 2 months focused on the medical and technical aspects of the twins' problem, but he had never considered that they might be feeling his own pain, his own anguish over the loss of Laura. Carmen quietly said her goodbyes, promising to return the next morning, but Edward barely heard her. His mind was processing what he had just witnessed, and Rosa's words. There was something about that woman that went beyond her ability to calm babies. There was a wisdom born of suffering, an understanding of human pain that touched him deeply. As Rosa headed back toward the staff quarters, Edward called out to her. "Rosa, wait!" She turned, expectant. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried a weight that went far beyond gratitude for a night of sleep for his daughters. Rosa just nodded and continued on her way, leaving Edward alone in the hallway. He stood there for long minutes, listening to the blessed silence that emanated from the twins' room. For the first time since Laura's death, Edward felt that maybe he wasn't completely alone on his journey as a father. When he finally returned to his room, Edward lay down on the bed he hadn't shared with anyone for 2 months and closed his eyes. His last thought before falling asleep was the sound of Rosa's voice singing to his daughters, and the strange feeling that something fundamental had changed in his life in those early morning hours. The twins slept for 6 hours straight for the first time since they were born, and so did Edward. The next morning brought something Edward had forgotten existed, the peaceful silence of a house where babies sleep soundly. When he opened his eyes at 8 o'clock, he lay still for a few moments, waiting for the familiar sound of crying that usually woke him. But all he heard was the chirping of cardinals in the garden and the distant hum of traffic on I-95. Edward got up slowly, almost afraid that any movement might break the spell of the previous night. He walked barefoot to the twins' room and found Isabella and Helena still sleeping soundly, their breathing soft and regular. Carmen had arrived promptly, at 7, and was sitting in the armchair watching the babies with an expression of disbelief that mirrored Edward's own feelings. "In 20 years in this profession, I've never seen anything like it," the nurse murmured as Edward entered the room. "They woke up once during the night, took their bottles peacefully and went right back to sleep. Not even a whimper of discomfort." Edward nodded, still processing the inexplicable transformation of his daughters. There was something about last night that defied all the medical and scientific logic he had tried to apply to the twins' problem. The sound of Rosa singing continued to echo in his mind, filled with a tenderness he couldn't fully comprehend. He went down to the kitchen for coffee and found Rosa preparing breakfast as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She wore the same navy blue uniform from the day before, and her hair was tied in the same low bun. But Edward watched her with different eyes. There was a natural grace in her movements as she made scrambled eggs and toast, a serenity he hadn't noticed before. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," she said without looking up from the skillet. "Coffee's ready. I also made some fresh squeezed orange juice the way Mrs. Laura liked it." The mention of his wife caused a familiar pang in Edward's chest, but this time it wasn't accompanied by the devastating anguish he felt every morning. It was as if the peace his daughters had found during the night had created a small space in his heart for emotions other than pain. "Rosa," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table, something he hadn't done in months. "About last night. I'd like to understand what happened." Rosa finally looked at him, her dark eyes revealing a vulnerability she tried to hide. "I don't know if I can explain it right, Mr. Montgomery. I just did what my heart told me to do." Edward took a sip of coffee and realized it tasted better than usual. For the past few months, he had survived on instant coffee and pre-made sandwiches, but Rosa had taken it upon herself to look after his meals without him asking. "That song you sang," Edward insisted. "I'd never heard it before. Is it from your hometown?" Rosa hesitated, stirring the eggs in the skillet with more force than necessary. It's a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me when I was little. My grandma Francisca was a midwife back home, helped bring more than 200 babies into the world. She used to say that every baby is born with a song in its heart, and sometimes we just need to help them remember what it is. Rosa's words touched something deep within Edward. There was an ancient wisdom in her explanation that contrasted dramatically with the technical analyses and medical diagnoses he had been hearing for months. It was as if she had access to a knowledge that couldn't be learned in universities or medical textbooks. "And you learned that from your grandmother?" Edward asked, genuinely interested in learning more about the woman who had brought peace to his daughters. Rosa served the eggs on Edward's plate and moved away, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. "I learned a lot from Grandma Francisca. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. The revelation hit Edward like a lightning bolt. He had assumed Rosa was just another woman from a small town looking for work in the city, but now he realized she carried her own losses and tragedies. There was something in her story that explained the depth in her eyes and the natural way she had connected with his daughter's pain. "I'm so sorry," Edward said, and the words came out with a genuine empathy that surprised him. "It must have been so hard to lose your parents so young," Rosa shrugged, a gesture that tried to downplay the pain, but Edward could see the subject still affected her deeply. "Grandma Francisca always said that loss is a part of life, but we can choose whether we let it harden us or make us more human." While Edward ate his breakfast, Rosa continued her household chores, but he felt that a barrier had been broken between them. For the first time since she had started working in the mansion, they had talked like two human beings who shared the experience of loss, rather than as an employer and an employee. The phone rang, interrupting the quiet moment. It was Dr. Miller, the twins' pediatrician, calling to see how the night had gone and if they needed to schedule new tests. Edward reported the girls' inexplicable improvement, deliberately omitting the details of Rosa's intervention. Something stopped him from sharing that experience with the doctor, as if it were too sacred to be subjected to scientific scrutiny. After hanging up, Edward went upstairs to check on the twins and found them awake but calm in their cribs. Isabella was watching a colourful mobile that Laura had chosen, while Helena contentedly sucked on her little hand. It was the first time he had seen his daughters simply happy. Carmen commented that the babies had fed well in the last hour and had clean diapers but showed no signs of agitation. It was as if the previous nights, transformation had created a new behavioral pattern for them, a tranquility that remained even during their waking hours. For the rest of the morning, Edward tried to focus on some company matters that had piled up during the weeks of crisis with the twins. His development company was in the middle of 3 major residential projects in the New York metropolitan area, and he had practically abandoned the direct management of the business to deal with his daughter's problem. But even as he tried to focus on work, Edward found himself thinking about Rosa and the inexplicable transformation she had brought to his home. There was something about her that piqued his curiosity in a way he hadn't felt since Laura's death. It wasn't romantic attraction, at least he didn't think it was, but a genuine fascination with a person who seemed to carry secrets and wisdom he knew nothing about. Around noon, Edward went down for lunch and found Rosa preparing a simple packed lunch for herself. She usually ate in the service area, maintaining the proper distance between employer and employee, but Edward invited her to eat in the dining room. "Rosa, why don't you have lunch? Here with me. The table is too big for one person." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the break in protocol. "I don't know if that's appropriate, Mr. Montgomery. You can go ahead. I'll just eat in the laundry room." "I insist," Edward said, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. "After what you did for the girls last night, I think you at least deserve to eat at a decent table." Rosa reluctantly accepted the invitation and sat at the far end of the rosewood table that Laura had chosen for the dining room. Edward noticed that she ate slowly, savoring each bite like someone who had known scarcity. There was a mindfulness in her gestures that spoke of a life where nothing could be wasted. "Rosa, can I ask why you came to New York?" Edward said, trying to keep his tone casual. Rosa chewed thoughtfully before answering. There was nothing left for me back home, Mr. Montgomery. After Grandma Francisca passed away last year, I was all alone, and there were other things that made me want to start a new life far away from there." Edward sensed there was pain in Rosa's words, a sadness that went beyond the loss of her grandmother. There was something else in her story, some event that had driven her to leave everything behind and start over in a city where she knew no one. "It must have been brave, coming to a big city like New York without knowing anyone," Edward commented, genuinely impressed. "Courage or desperation," Rosa said with a bitter smile. "Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." There was a raw honesty in Rosa's words that touched Edward deeply. He was used to superficial conversations about business and investments or the polished formalities of New York's high society. Rosa's direct simplicity was refreshing, but also intimidating in its authenticity. After lunch, Edward returned to his office, but found himself looking out the window at the garden where Rosa was hanging clothes on the line. There was a serenity in her movements that contrasted with the constant turmoil that had dominated the mansion for the past few months. It was as if she brought a peace with her that spread to every room she entered. In the afternoon, when the twins started to get restless, Edward called for Rosa before the crying could escalate. She came immediately, and again her presence seemed to have an instant calming effect on Isabella and Helena. Edward watched, fascinated, as she spoke softly to the babies, as if they could understand every word. "You are two very special princesses," Rosa murmured, gently stroking the twins' rosy cheeks. "Your daddy loves you very much, and your mommy is watching from heaven, so proud of the beautiful girls you are." The words about Laura brought tears to Edward's eyes. It was the first time someone had mentioned his wife in a way that didn't leave him devastated by loss, but rather grateful for the memories they had built together. That night, Rosa sang to the twins again, and they slept peacefully. But this time, Edward stayed in the room a little longer, listening to the melodious voice that had become the soundtrack of peace in his home. There were layers to Rosa's song that he hadn't noticed the night before, nuances of emotion that suggested deep personal experiences. When Rosa finished singing and the twins were asleep, Edward walked her to the door of the room. "Rosa, can I ask you something?" he said in a low voice. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. The song you sing, does it have a special meaning for you?" Rosa looked down, and Edward could see that the question had touched on something very intimate. "It's the song Grandma Francisca sang when I lost my baby," she said, almost in a whisper. The world seemed to stop around Edward. Rosa had lost a child. Suddenly, it all made sense. The natural way she cared for the twins, the depth of emotion in her voice when she sang, the way she seemed to understand the baby's pain on a visceral level. "Rosa, I didn't know. I'm so sorry," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was 2 years ago," Rosa said without looking up. "A boy. He was born sleeping, as Grandma Francisca used to say. The doctor said it was a problem with the cord, that it couldn't have been predicted or prevented." Edward felt a deep connection to Rosa's pain. They had both lost someone at a moment that should have been one of pure joy. They both carried invisible scars that others couldn't fully comprehend. "The baby's father?" Edward asked gently. Rosa smiled bitterly. "He left me when he found out I was pregnant, said he wasn't ready to be a father. When the baby died, he said maybe it was for the best." The cruelty of her ex-partner's words shocked Edward. He couldn't imagine how anyone could be so callous in the face of such a devastating loss. Now Edward understood why Rosa had left her hometown and come to New York. She was fleeing not only the pain of her loss, but the cruelty of a man who had turned her tragedy into his personal relief. "That's why you understand the girls so well," Edward said, more to himself than to Rosa. "Every mother who has lost a child recognizes the cry of a baby who needs love," Rosa said. "Your girls weren't sick, Mr. Montgomery. They were missing their mother and needed someone who understood that pain." Rosa's words revealed a truth that all the specialists had missed. Isabella and Helena weren't suffering from colic or allergies. They were motherless babies who needed someone who understood the void that Laura's absence had left in their lives. That night, Edward lay in his bed with a completely new feeling in his chest. For the first time since Laura's death, he didn't feel completely alone in his grief. Rosa had shared her own tragedy with him, and this exchange of vulnerabilities had created a connection that transcended the social differences between them. The twins slept soundly for the second night in a row, and Edward also managed to get some real rest. In his dreams he heard Rosa's voice singing, but this time the song wasn't just about comforting motherless babies. It was also about two wounded souls who had found in each other the possibility of healing. A week had passed since Rosa's revelation about losing her son, and the mansion in Greenwich had been completely transformed. The twins, Isabella and Helena, were sleeping regularly, feeding peacefully, and spending their waking hours playing and smiling in their cribs. Dr. Miller was so impressed with the sudden improvement that he even questioned Edward about possible changes in the baby's medication or diet. Edward hadn't told the pediatrician about Rosa. Something prevented him from turning that quiet miracle into an object of medical analysis. It was as if he instinctively knew that the magic of those moments would be lost if subjected to scientific scrutiny. The twins' transformation couldn't be explained in terms of procedures or protocols. It was something born from the purest human connection Edward had ever witnessed. Rosa herself seemed to have blossomed in recent days. There was a lightness in her step that wasn't there when she first arrived at the mansion 3 months ago. Edward would secretly watch her as she hummed softly during her household chores or when she played with the twins on sunny afternoons in the garden. It was as if caring for Isabella and Helena was healing old wounds in her own heart. Edward had cancelled the appointments with the last 2 specialists, still on the waiting list. The nurse Carmen now came only 3 times a week, as her constant presence was no longer necessary. Rosa had naturally taken over much of the twins' care, and Edward not only allowed it, but encouraged this closeness. On Thursday morning, Edward was reviewing contracts in his office when he heard laughter coming from the garden. He looked out the window and saw Rosa sitting on the grass with the twins, who were lying on a colourful blanket under the shade of the sprawling oak tree that Laura had planted in their first year of marriage. Rosa was making funny faces, and Isabella and Helena responded with crystal-clear giggles that Edward hadn't heard since they were born. The scene moved him deeply. This was exactly how Laura had dreamed of spending afternoons with her daughters. She always said she wanted to be the kind of mom who played on the floor, who didn't mind getting her clothes dirty or messing up her hair to make her children smile. Rosa was giving the twins exactly what Laura had planned to give them. Edward set the contracts aside and went down to the garden. As he approached the blanket, Isabella looked at him and held out her little arms, asking to be picked up. It was the first time she had shown that kind of affection toward her father. In recent months, Edward had become associated only with failed attempts to calm them, but now, with the peace that Rosa had brought, the twins could finally connect with him emotionally. "They look beautiful today," Edward said, picking up Isabella and sitting on the grass next to Rosa. "I don't think I've ever seen them so happy," Rosa smiled, stroking Helena's golden hair. "Children are like little plants, Mr. Montgomery. They blossom when they find the right soil. And you are the right soil for them," Edward said, and the words were filled with a gratitude that went far beyond relief for his daughter's improvement. Rosa had become an essential presence in his life, someone he could no longer imagine his day-to-day without. Rosa blushed slightly at the comment, looking away toward Helena. "I just do what anyone would do. They're special babies. They deserve all the love in the world." Edward watched Rosa's delicate profile as she played with Helena. There was a natural beauty about her that he hadn't noticed at first. It wasn't the artificial, calculated beauty of the women in his social class, but something genuine that came from within. Her dark eyes reflected a wisdom born of suffering, and her mouth, always ready to smile for the twins, revealed a generosity of spirit that touched him deeply. "Rosa," Edward said hesitantly, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked at him with curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. Have you ever thought about having other children, about rebuilding your life with someone?" The question clearly caught her by surprise, and Edward immediately regretted asking. It was too intimate, too invasive for the relationship they had. Rosa took a long time to answer, her fingers tracing distracted patterns on the colorful blanket. After I lost John, I thought I would never be able to love another baby the same way. I thought my heart was broken for good. John. Edward now knew the name of the son Rosa had lost, and the revelation moved him even more. But now, taking care of Isabella and Helena, Rosa continued, I feel like maybe there's still room in my heart to love, not in the same way. I love John, but in a new, different way. Edward felt something tighten in his chest as he heard those words. The possibility of Rosa finding someone and leaving his life stirred a feeling in him that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the fear of losing a good employee or someone who took good care of his daughters. It was something deeper, more personal. And what about you? Rosa asked softly. Have you ever thought about getting married again? Giving the girls a mother? Rosa's question caught him completely off guard. Edward had assumed he would never marry. Again, that his love life had ended with Laura's death. But in recent days, in Rosa's presence, he had begun to question that certainty. I don't know if I could love someone the way I loved Laura, Edward said honestly. She was perfect for me. I don't know if there's room in my heart for anyone else. Rosa nodded understandingly. Love isn't a jar that empties when you give some away, Mr. Montgomery. It's like a spring that grows the more you use it. Your wife wouldn't want you to be alone forever. Rosa's words echoed in Edward's mind for the rest of the day. There was a simple wisdom in them that contrasted with all the complex philosophy he had built around his widowhood. Laura really wouldn't have wanted to see him isolated and bitter for the rest of his life. She had been a woman who celebrated love in all its forms. On Friday, Edward made a decision that surprised him. He cancelled his afternoon work commitments and invited Rosa to take the twins to Greenwich Point Park. It was something he had never done before, going out casually with his daughters and an employee, but he felt a growing need to spend time with Rosa outside the formal environment of the mansion. Rosa hesitated at first, clearly concerned about the social propriety of such an outing, but Edward insisted. The girls need some fresh air, and I need to get out of this house before I become a complete hermit. The park was bustling on that sunny August afternoon. Families were enjoying the long weekend, children were playing on the playgrounds, and couples were strolling along the tree-lined paths. Edward pushed the double stroller where Isabella and Helena watched everything with curiosity, while Rosa walked beside him, pointing out birds and flowers to the babies. For the first time in months, Edward felt like a normal person. He wasn't the widowed, desperate businessman trying to save his sick daughters, nor the rich man who could buy anything except peace. He was simply a father strolling in the park with his daughters and a woman who had become important in his life. Mr. Montgomery, Rosa said as they watched the twins try to catch a butterfly fluttering near the stroller, can I ask what Mrs. Laura was like? Edward smiled, and for the first time, talking about his wife didn't just bring pain. She was pure light. She laughed too loud, talked too fast, and loved too intensely. She never did anything by halves. How did you two meet? Rosa asked, genuinely interested. At her business school graduation party. I was 28, she was 23. She was wearing a yellow dress and arguing about politics with a group of men who thought they were very important. When I approached, she looked me up and down and said, "Let me guess, another businessman who thinks money solves everything." Rosa laughed, imagining the scene. And what did you say? That she was right and that I'd like a chance to prove I was wrong, Edward said, smiling at the memory. It took her 3 months to agree to go out with me. She said she didn't want to be another trophy wife in a rich man's collection. But she fell in love with you, Rosa said softly. We fell in love with each other. The distinction is important, Edward corrected. Laura was never submissive or passive. She challenged me every day, made me want to be a better man. Rosa listened intently, and Edward could see she was building a mental image of Laura through his words. There was something comforting in sharing these memories with someone who hadn't known his wife, but seemed genuinely interested in understanding her. She would be happy to know the girls are being well taken care of, Rosa said after a moment of silence. Yes, she would, and she would be grateful to you for doing what I couldn't, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. They continued walking in comfortable silence, watching the twins who had fallen asleep, lulled by the motion of the stroller. It was a moment of perfect peace that Edward wished he could prolong indefinitely. When they returned to the mansion late that afternoon, Edward helped Rosa bathe the twins and put them to bed. It was a simple domestic routine he had missed in the months of crisis, but now it felt natural and comforting. There was something deeply intimate about caring for his daughters alongside Rosa, as if they were a real family instead of an employer and an employee. After putting the twins in their cribs, Edward and Rosa went down to the kitchen. Edward was opening a bottle of wine when Rosa mentioned she needed to go to her room, but he invited her to have a glass with him. "Rosa, you've done so much for me and the girls these past few weeks. Let me at least offer you a good glass of wine as a thank you." Rosa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the growing intimacy between them. "I don't know if that's appropriate, Mr. Montgomery. You're my boss, and I'm just a housekeeper." "You're not just a housekeeper," Edward said firmly. "You saved my daughters. You brought peace to this house. You helped me remember that life is worth living." Edward's words carried an emotional weight that even he hadn't realized until he spoke them. Rosa looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Rosa accepted the glass of wine, and they sat in the living room where a wood-burning fireplace created a cozy atmosphere. Edward put on some soft music, and for the first time in months, the mansion felt like a real home instead of an elegant mausoleum. "Can I tell you something?" Edward said after a few sips of wine. "Of course." "Before you came here, I had given up on everything. On the girls, on myself, on life. I woke up every day expecting things to get worse because it seemed like that was the only possible future." Rosa listened to him intently, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "But since you started taking care of the girls, since you brought your music and your love into this house, I've started to believe that maybe there's still hope, that maybe life can still be good." "Mr. Montgomery," Rosa said softly, "you always had that strength inside you. I just helped you remember where it was. Hidden." Edward leaned forward, his eyes meeting Rosa's. "Rosa, I need to tell you something important." "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you." The words came out before Edward could censor them, carrying a truth he was only just discovering himself. Rosa froze, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hands. "Mr. Montgomery, you can't say things like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why not? It's the truth." "Because you're a rich man, and I'm a poor housekeeper from a small town. Because the difference between us is too great. Because you're still grieving for your wife." Edward got up and knelt in front of the armchair where Rosa was sitting. "Rosa, look at me." She reluctantly raised her eyes. "Do you think I care about money or social class after everything you've done for me? Do you think the size of your bank account matters when you saved my daughters' lives? Mr. Montgomery, please, don't make things complicated. I care about you and the girls very much. But this is crazy." Edward gently took Rosa's hands in his. "Rosa, I know it's complicated, I know it's scary, but I can't pretend anymore that you're just a housekeeper to me. You've become essential to my life." Rosa had tears in her eyes. "What if it goes wrong? What if you get tired of me? I can't lose the girls now. They've become my reason for living." "You will never lose the girls," Edward said firmly. "Regardless of what happens between us, you will always be a part of their lives. I promise you that." Rosa stood up abruptly, moving away from Edward. "I need to think. This is all very confusing for me." Edward nodded, respecting the space she needed. "Okay, take all the time you need. But know that what I feel for you is real, Rosa, and it's not going away." Rosa went up to her room without another word, leaving Edward alone in the living room with the crackling fire and the echo of his own confession ringing in his mind. He had crossed a line he could no longer retreat from, and now all he could do was wait to see if Rosa was willing to cross that line with him. Rosa spent the entire night wide awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room in the staff quarters of the mansion. Edward's words echoed in her mind like a persistent hum she couldn't silence. "I'm falling in love with you." How could something so simple be at once so wonderful and so terrifying? She got up before dawn, as she always did, but her movements were mechanical, automatic. She made coffee, tidied the kitchen, and went up to check on the twins. But her mind was completely divided. One part of her wanted to run away, to pack her few belongings and go back to Texas before the situation got any more complicated. The other part, the part she tried to ignore, whispered that maybe Edward was sincere, that maybe it was possible to believe in love again. When Edward came down for breakfast, Rosa kept her eyes fixed on the skillet where she was making scrambled eggs. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but didn't have the courage to meet his eyes. The intimacy of the previous night had created a tension in the air that she didn't know how to handle. "Good morning, Rosa," Edward said softly, sitting at the table. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," she replied, her voice more formal than usual. Edward immediately noticed the change in Rosa's behavior. The warm closeness that had developed between them over the past few weeks had been replaced by a polite, professional distance. She had retreated into the safe role of an employee, hiding behind the social protocols that separated them. "Rosa, about last night," Edward began. "You don't need to talk about it," Rosa interrupted quickly. "I understand you were emotional, grateful for what happened with the girls. Sometimes gratitude can be mistaken for other feelings." Edward stood up and approached her, but she kept her back to him, stirring the eggs with more force than necessary. "Rosa, look at me. I need to finish your breakfast." "Rosa, please." She finally turned, and Edward could see that her eyes were red, swollen from a sleepless night, and perhaps from tears she had shed in silence. "What I said last night wasn't confused gratitude," Edward said firmly. "It was the clearest truth I've ever spoken in my life." Rosa shook her head as if to ward off his words. "Mr. Montgomery, you don't understand. I can't let myself believe that." "Why not?" "Because I've been abandoned once before when things got complicated. Because I know how rich men treat women like me when they get tired of the novelty. Because I can't risk losing the girls." Edward felt a pang of pain at Rosa's words. She had been so hurt by her ex-partner that she couldn't believe in any man's sincerity now, and the class difference between them created a barrier that seemed insurmountable to her. "Rosa, I'm not him. I won't abandon you." "That's what they all say at the beginning," Rosa said, turning back to the eggs. "But when the passion fades and reality sets in, when your friends start making comments about the little housekeeper who moved up in the world, when Mrs. Laura's family finds out you're involved with a woman with no formal education—" "Stop," Edward said, gently touching her arm. "You're creating problems that don't exist." "I'm not creating anything," Rosa said, her tears finally overflowing. "I'm being realistic. You live in a different world from mine, Mr. Montgomery. A world where I might be tolerated as an employee, but never accepted as an equal." Edward wanted to argue, to convince her she was wrong, but deep down he knew Rosa was right about many things. His business, friends, his family, the high society of New York where he moved. Many would indeed make snide remarks about a relationship between him and a domestic worker. The sound of one of the twins crying interrupted the tense conversation. Rosa immediately wiped her tears and went upstairs to care for the girls, leaving Edward alone in the kitchen with his eggs cooling on the plate and a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Over the next few days, Rosa maintained a respectful but painful distance from Edward. She continued to care for the twins with the same love and dedication, but always in the presence of the nurse, Carmen, or when Edward wasn't around. On the rare occasions they needed to speak, she addressed him only as Mr. Montgomery and kept her eyes downcast. Edward tried to respect the space Rosa had asked for, but with each passing day he grew more frustrated with the situation. It wasn't just that she had rejected his feelings, it was the way she had completely shut down, as if the intimacy they had shared had never existed. On Wednesday, Edward received a call from his sister-in-law, Mariana, Laura's younger sister. Mariana had always been close to the couple and had offered to help with the twins after her sister's death, but Edward had refused her help at the time, preferring to handle the situation alone. "Edward, how are the girls?" Mariana asked. "It's been a while since I've stopped by to visit them. They're fine, very well actually. The crying problem is solved." "That's wonderful. Did the specialists finally figure out what it was?" Edward hesitated before answering. Not exactly. It was something simpler than we thought. Can I come by this weekend? I'm dying to see my nieces. Edward agreed to the visit, but after hanging up he felt a strange anxiety. Mariana was a lovely person, but she was also part of the social world that Rosa feared. She asked direct questions, observed everything carefully, and didn't hesitate to express her opinions. On Saturday morning, Mariana arrived at the mansion with gifts for the twins and a bouquet of flowers to place on Laura's grave, which she planned to visit with Edward later that day. She was an elegant 35-year-old woman, a successful lawyer, married to a doctor, and mother to 2 teenagers. When Rosa opened the door to greet her, Mariana was polite, but Edward noticed the appraising look his sister-in-law gave the housekeeper. Rosa was impeccable, as always, in her well-pressed uniform and tidy hair, but there was something in her posture that betrayed nervousness. "So you're Rosa," Mariana said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Edward told me you've been a great help with the girls." "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Rosa replied, maintaining a formal tone. Edward introduced Mariana to the twins, who were radiant and smiling in their double stroller. His sister-in-law was visibly impressed with the baby's transformation since her last visit. "My God, Edward, they're completely different. They look like normal, happy babies. What on earth happened here?" Edward tried to explain the twins' improvement in vague terms, mentioning changes in routine and diet, but Mariana was too smart to accept superficial explanations. During lunch, which Rosa had prepared flawlessly, she continued to ask subtle questions. "Rosa, how long have you been working with children?" Mariana asked. "Actually, I hadn't worked with children before, ma'am. My experience was more in cleaning and general housekeeping." "Interesting," Mariana said, exchanging a meaningful look with Edward. "And how did you discover you had such a talent for calming babies?" Rosa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. "I grew up helping my grandmother, who was a midwife. I guess I learned a few things from her." Edward could feel the tension mounting. Mariana was clearly intrigued by Rosa's influence over the twins, and Rosa seemed to be shrinking with every question. After lunch, while Rosa was washing dishes in the kitchen, Mariana pulled Edward into the living room. "Edward, what's really going on here?" she asked directly. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. That housekeeper has an influence over the girls that's far from normal, and I see the way you look at her." Edward felt his face flush. "Mariana, you're imagining things." "I'm a lawyer, Edward. I observe human behavior for a living. There's something going on between you two." Edward stood up and walked to the window, trying to buy time to think. Mariana was too perceptive, and he wasn't prepared for this conversation. "Edward," Mariana said softly, perching on the edge of the sofa, "look, I'm not going to judge you. Laura's been gone for 4 months, and you have every right to move on, but this woman, what about her? She's a domestic worker, Edward. Do you really think this can work?" Mariana's words echoed the exact fears Rosa had expressed. Edward turned to face her. "Do you think I should judge people by the work they do? I think you should be practical. You come from completely different worlds. She has no formal education, no money. She doesn't know our social circle. How are you going to introduce her to your friends, to your business partner, to my daughters?" Every word from Mariana was like a stab to Edward's heart, not because he agreed with her, but because he knew Rosa had predicted this exact reaction. "Mariana, Rosa is an incredible woman. She saved my daughters when no specialist could. She has a kindness and a wisdom that most people in our social circle don't even know exists. Edward, I'm not questioning her qualities as a person or a caregiver. I'm questioning whether you two are compatible for a serious relationship. And who decides that? You?" Mariana sighed, clearly frustrated. "Edward, you're emotionally vulnerable. You've been through a terrible loss. Your daughters were sick. You were desperate. It's natural for you to feel grateful and confused about the person who brought relief to your life. You think I don't know the difference between gratitude and love. I think you should take a step back and think carefully about what you're doing, for your own good and for the good of the girls." At that moment, Rosa appeared at the living room door, holding a tray with coffee. It was obvious she had overheard at least part of the conversation because her face was pale and her hands were trembling slightly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I brought the coffee you asked for." Mariana smiled politely, but Edward could see the tension in her face. Rosa served the coffee quickly and withdrew, but not before Edward noticed the tears she was trying to hide. The rest of the afternoon passed in an uncomfortable atmosphere. Mariana played with the twins and talked about family matters, but Edward could barely concentrate. He was thinking about Rosa, who had retreated to the back of the house and hadn't reappeared. When Mariana finally left late in the afternoon, Edward immediately went to find Rosa. He found her in the twins' room, singing softly to Isabella and Helena as they settled down for the night. Her voice was broken, and Edward could see she had been crying. "Rosa," he said gently. She turned, and Edward saw in her eyes a deep sadness that broke his heart. "I heard what she said," Rosa said. "And she's right. I don't belong in your world, Mr. Montgomery." "Rosa, don't let Mariana's words—" "It's not just her," Rosa interrupted. "It's reality. I always knew this day would come, the day someone from your social circle would remind you of who you are and who I am." Edward moved closer to her, but Rosa stepped back. "Rosa, please listen to me." "I'm leaving, Mr. Montgomery." The words hit Edward like a thunderbolt. "What did you say?" "I'm leaving. It's better this way before things get more complicated." "You can't leave. What about the girls?" "The girls will be fine. They don't need me to sleep anymore. Any competent nanny can take care of them now." Edward felt panic rising in him. The thought of Rosa leaving his life was unbearable, but he could see that his sister-in-law had destroyed the fragile trust Rosa had been starting to build. "Rosa, I don't care what anyone thinks. I only care about you." Rosa looked at him with an expression that mixed love and sadness in equal measure. "I know you believe that now," she said softly. "But one day you'll realize they're right. And on that day, I don't want to be here to see the disappointment in your eyes. That will never happen." "You can't promise that," Rosa said, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you don't know how you'll feel when you have to introduce me as your girlfriend at a company party, or when your friends start making jokes. Say about you and the little housekeeper." Edward wanted to argue, to convince her she was wrong, but the seeds of doubt Mariana had planted were sprouting in his mind. Would he be strong enough to face the social prejudice? Would his love for Rosa be greater than the pressure of his social class? Rosa finished putting the twins in their cribs and headed for the door. "I'll stay until you find a replacement," she said, "but then I'm leaving." Edward was left alone in the twins' room, listening to Rosa's footsteps fading down the hall. For the first time since his confession, he wondered if maybe everyone was right, if maybe love wasn't enough to overcome the differences that separated them. The twins slept peacefully, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Edward watched them for long minutes, trying to imagine his life without Rosa. The idea was devastating, but perhaps it was the only way to protect everyone involved from even greater pain in the future. That night, the mansion was silent again, but it was no longer the peaceful silence of recent days. It was the heavy silence of an impending farewell, of a love that couldn't find its way through the barriers society builds. Edward lay in his bed, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. In his heart, a silent war had begun. The love he felt for Rosa against the social conventions that had shaped his entire life, and he didn't yet know which side would win. The next 3 days passed in a painful haze over the mansion in Greenwich. Rosa had discreetly posted an ad on job sites looking for a new nanny for the twins, and Edward pretended not to know, though he had seen the printed papers on the kitchen table. They barely spoke, limiting their interactions to what was strictly necessary for the running of the house. Edward spent hours locked in his office, trying to focus on his development company's business, but his mind always drifted back to Rosa. He would watch her secretly from the window as she hung clothes on the line or played with the twins in the garden. There was a silent sadness in her movements that tore him apart inside. On Tuesday morning, Edward received a call from Mark Stevens. his partner at the development company and his best friend since college. Mark had heard rumors through Mariana about the situation at the mansion and wanted to talk in person. "Edward, I'm coming over for lunch today. We need to talk." Edward knew he couldn't avoid the conversation indefinitely. Mark was like a brother to him. He had been there for every important moment in his life, including his wedding to Laura and her funeral. If anyone deserved to know the truth about his feelings for Rosa, it was Mark. Mark arrived at noon, driving his black BMW and wearing an impeccable Italian suit. At 44, he was single by choice, dated models and socialites, and lived the stereotype of the successful New York businessman. Edward had always admired Mark's freedom, but now he wondered if his friend would be able to understand a love that transcended social barriers. Rosa served lunch in the dining room with her usual efficiency, but Edward noticed how she kept her eyes down and quickly excused herself from Mark's presence. She clearly knew who he was and what the topic of their conversation would be. "So," Mark said, cutting into the grilled salmon Rosa had prepared, "Mariana told me about your situation here." Edward sighed. She exaggerated, as always. "Exaggerated in what way? In saying you're in love with the housekeeper, or in saying it's a terrible idea?" Mark's brutal honesty didn't surprise Edward. It was how his friend always talked about everything. "Mark, you don't know Rosa. She's an extraordinary person. I'm sure she is. Mariana said she worked miracles with the twins, but that doesn't change the fact that you two are incompatible. Why does everyone seem to know more about my life than I do?" Mark put his fork down and leaned forward. "Edward, you've been my best friend for 20 years. I saw you fall in love with Laura. I saw you build a life together. I saw you fall apart when she died. I care about you. Then support me. I can't support something that's going to hurt you even more." Edward stood up from the table, frustrated. "Why is everyone so sure this is going to end badly?" "Because we know reality, Edward. You think it's just about love. What about when you go to dinner at the club? What about when she meets our clients? What about when you travel abroad? I can teach her about those things." "Teach her?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Did you hear what you just said? You want to turn her into an acceptable version of herself?" Mark's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. There was something deeply wrong with the idea of teaching Rosa how to behave in his social world. It implied she was inadequate as she was. "That's not what I meant," Edward protested. "It's exactly what you meant," Mark said firmly. "And you know why? Because deep down, you know she doesn't fit into your world. You're trying to force a situation that can't work." Edward returned to the table, but he had completely lost his appetite. "What if I changed my world?" "What do you mean?" "What if I simplified my life? What if I stopped caring about what other people think?" Mark shook his head. "Edward, you have a company that employs 200 people. You have social and financial responsibilities that go far beyond your personal feelings. You can't just disappear to live out some impossible romance." "Why is it impossible?" "Because you are who you are, and she is who she is. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they are realities that don't mix without consequences." The conversation continued for another hour, with Mark presenting logical arguments and Edward trying to counter them with emotion. In the end, they were both frustrated and tired. After Mark left, Edward found Rosa in the twins' room, changing Helena's diaper. It was the first time in days they had been alone, and the tension in the air was palpable. "Rosa," he said softly. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery." "Did you hear the conversation I had with Mark?" Rosa hesitated before answering. "Not intentionally, but I heard some of it." "And what did you think?" Rosa finished changing Helena and placed her in the crib before turning to Edward. "I thought he was telling the truth. He cares about you." "But do you agree with him?" Rosa looked him in the eyes for the first time in days. "Mr. Montgomery, I always knew this was impossible. I tried to tell you from the beginning. What if I say I don't care about their opinions? What if I say I'm willing to face any consequence to be with you?" Rosa smiled sadly. "I'd say you're being too romantic and not realistic enough." "Rosa, I love you," the words came. The words, out laden with a desperation Edward couldn't hide. Rosa closed her eyes, as if hearing this declaration was physically painful. "I love you too," she said quietly. Rosa's confession made Edward's heart race. It was the first time she had admitted her feelings, and that changed everything. "Then let's try," Edward said, taking her hands. "Let's face whatever comes together." "No," Rosa said firmly, pulling her hands away. "It's precisely because I love you that I can't let this continue." "That doesn't make any sense." "It makes all the sense in the world," Rosa said, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too much to watch you lose friends, clients, social standing because of me. I love you too much to see the day you look at me with regret in your eyes. That will never happen. It will. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but it will happen. And when it does, we'll both be destroyed." Edward felt he was losing the battle. All the logical arguments seemed to be against them, but his heart refused to accept defeat. "Rosa, give me a chance to prove you wrong." "How?" The question caught Edward off guard. How exactly? Would he prove he could overcome decades of social conditioning? How would he guarantee he would never regret his choice? I don't know yet, but I'll find a way." Rosa shook her head. "Mr. Montgomery, you're a good man, the best man I've ever known, but you can't fight the whole world, and I can't let you destroy yourself trying." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He paced around the house, past the twins' room where Rosa was singing softly to them, through the kitchen where she had left everything tidy for the next day to the garden where she hung clothes while humming. The idea of living without Rosa was unbearable, but so was the idea of dragging them both into an impossible situation. On Thursday morning, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He called Mark and arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Manhattan. When they met, Edward had a determined expression that Mark had never seen before. "Mark, I need your help with something." "Of course. What do you need?" "I want to sell my share of the company." Mark nearly spilled his coffee. "Have you gone completely insane?" "I've never been more sane in my life. I want to sell my share to you, take the money and start a new life." "Edward, you're talking about throwing away 20 years of work for an infatuation." "It's not an infatuation, Mark. It's love. The kind of love that comes along once in a lifetime, if you're lucky." Mark studied his friend's face for a long moment. There was a conviction in Edward that he had never seen before, not even when he married Laura. "And where are you going with this new life?" "I don't know yet. Maybe to a small town, maybe somewhere in the South. Somewhere I can just be Edward, not Edward Montgomery of Montgomery and Stevens Development." "And does Rosa agree with this crazy plan?" "She doesn't know yet. She thinks it's impossible for us to be together because I'll never give up my world. I want to prove to her that she's worth more than this entire world." Mark was silent for several long minutes, processing what Edward had said. Finally, he sighed. "Edward, are you absolutely sure about this?" "I am. Because if you do this and then regret it, there's no going back. You can't just come back and rebuild everything." "I know." Mark nodded slowly. "Then let's talk numbers." The negotiation took the rest of the week. Edward told Rosa nothing of his plans, wanting to have everything settled before presenting his proposal. He sold his share of the company for a sum that would ensure a comfortable but not luxurious life. He also sold the mansion in Greenwich, keeping only a smaller apartment in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens. On Saturday morning, Edward called Rosa for a talk in the garden where they had spent such happy afternoons with the twins. Rosa came reluctantly, clearly expecting another attempt to convince her to stay. "Rosa, I did something," Edward said, taking a deep breath. "What did you do?" "I sold the company and this house." Rosa looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "What are you talking about?" "I sold everything. I want to start a new life in a small town far from here. I want you to come with me." "Mr. Montgomery, you can't have done that." "I did. And I did it because you're worth more than any business or big house." Rosa sat down heavily on the garden bench, clearly in shock. "Mr. Montgomery, you've lost your mind. You don't throw away an entire life for a woman." "It's not throwing it away. It's choosing what really matters." "And the girls? You're going to take them out of their world for me?" Isabella and Helena will grow up in a family where love is more important than social status. They'll learn that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account. Rosa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Montgomery, you can't do this, not for me. I'm not doing it for you, Edward said firmly. I'm doing it for me, because I've discovered that I can't live without you. What if it goes wrong? What if you regret it? Edward knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Rosa, I spent 4 months thinking I had lost everything when Laura died. But then you appeared and showed me that there was still life inside me. You taught me that there was still love to give and receive. Mr. Montgomery, let me finish, Edward said softly. I can't promise you it will be easy. I can't promise you we won't face hardships, but can promise that I will love you every day of my life, anywhere, under any circumstances. Rosa was crying openly now. I'm scared. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of losing you than of facing anything life might throw at us. Rosa looked at the mansion where they had lived such intense moments, then at the twins playing in the stroller beside them, and finally at Edward. Are you absolutely sure about this? I am. And what if I say no? Then I'll respect your decision, but I still won't go back on what I've done because you helped me discover the kind of man I want to be. Rosa was silent for long minutes, and Edward could practically hear the thoughts racing through her head. Finally, she looked up at him. If I say yes, she said quietly, I don't want you to ever blame me for losing all of this. Rosa, I haven't lost anything. I've gained everything. Rosa took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to jump off a cliff. Then I accept, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Edward pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in weeks he kissed her. It was a kiss filled with promises, with hope, with a future they would build together against all odds. When they parted, Rosa was smiling through her tears. You're completely crazy. Completely, Edward agreed, smiling too. But crazy about you. That afternoon they began to make plans. Edward had already researched some small towns in Vermont where they could start over. He would use part of the money to start a small construction company, something simple that would allow him to support his family without the pressures of the corporate world. Rosa could hardly believe it was really happening. For the first time since she had arrived in New York, she allowed herself to dream of a happy future. A future where she would be loved and valued not in spite of who she was, but exactly for who she was. The twins, oblivious to the transformations happening around them, continued to laugh and play in the garden. Soon they would have a new life, a new town, and a mother who would love them as if they were her own. Edward looked at Rosa playing with Isabella and Helena, and knew he had made the right decision. Love had overcome all barriers, all prejudices, all fears. They would face whatever came their way together, because they had finally found something worth more than any material wealth. They had found each other. 6 months later, Edward woke to the sound of birds singing in the small town of Woodstock, Vermont. The simple 3-bedroom house they had rented was on a quiet street, surrounded by flower gardens and the constant aroma of fresh coffee from Mr. Antonio's bakery on the corner. It was a world away from the mansion in Greenwich, but Edward had never felt more at home, anywhere. Rosa was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming the same lullaby that had calmed the twins on that first magical night. Isabella and Helena, now 9 months old, were sitting in colorful high chairs, clapping their hands and laughing at their mother's song. Yes, Mother. Because that's what they had started calling Rosa in recent months, and that's how Edward thought of her now. The move to Woodstock hadn't been easy at first. Edward had to adapt to a completely different pace of life, far from the hustle of New York and the constant pressures of big business. He had started a small construction company specializing in home renovations and affordable housing. The revenue was a fraction of what he used to make, but it was more than enough to support his family with dignity. Rosa had blossomed in a way Edward had never imagined possible. Freed from the constraints of her role as a housekeeper, she had revealed herself to be a woman of strong opinions, sharp intelligence, and a sense of humor that brightened the toughest days. She had enrolled in the early childhood education program at the local college, fulfilling a lifelong dream of working with children. "Good morning, my love," Edward said, kissing the back of Rosa's neck as she stirred eggs in the skillet. "Good morning," Rosa replied, turning to kiss him on the lips. Even after 6 months, she was still surprised by the freedom to show her affection publicly, without fear of judgment or social protocols. "Daddy, Daddy!" Helena babbled, reaching her little arms out to Edward. "Hey there, princess," Edward said, picking Helena up. "Did you sleep well?" Isabella demanded attention too, and Edward found himself trying to balance both twins while Rosa laughed at the scene. It was a family routine that repeated every morning, simple and perfect in its normalcy. "Today's the appointment with Dr. Fernanda," Rosa reminded him, referring to the local pediatrician who saw the twins. "Right. What time was that again?" 2 o'clock. I was thinking we could stop by the town green afterward. The girls love watching the clowns who are there on Saturdays." Edward nodded, smiling at the simplicity of their plans. In New York, his weekends were filled with business dinners, mandatory social events, or trips to oversee construction sites. Now the most exciting outing was taking his daughters to see clowns on the town green. After breakfast, Edward went to the small office he had set up in the back of the house. He had 3 projects underway: a home renovation for a family of teachers, the construction of a new house for a retired couple, and the expansion of a small local business. They were projects that wouldn't make headlines in business journals, but they concretely changed the lives of the people involved. Around 10 in the morning, Edward received a call from Mark. It was their first contact in almost 2 months. "Edward, how are you?" "Doing great, Mark." "And you, how's business?" "Busy as ever. We closed that project in Newark we'd been chasing for months. We miss you here." Edward smiled. "I'm sure you guys are managing just fine without me." "Edward, I called because I'm worried about you." "Worried why?" "Man, it's been 6 months since you dropped off the face of the earth. Nobody sees you. You don't show up anywhere. Mariana told me you're living in some small town in the middle of nowhere." Edward could hear the disbelief in Mark's voice. To his former partner, giving up life in New York was incomprehensible. "I'm living in Woodstock, yes, and I'm very happy here." "Edward, don't you think you've had enough of this little game? You can come back whenever you want. I can buy you back in. We can restart our partnership." "Mark, I'm not playing a game. This is my life now." "But what kind of life is it, Edward? You were building an empire, you had prestige, recognition. And now you're doing what? Renovating little houses in the countryside?" Edward took a deep breath before answering. "Mark, do you remember how I felt in those last few years in New York, before Laura died?" "What do you mean? Do you remember me ever saying I was truly happy, fulfilled, that I woke up in the morning excited to start the day?" Mark was silent. "Because I remember always being tired, always stressed, always chasing more money, more projects, more recognition, and it was never enough." "But that's normal, Edward. That's the life of a businessman." "No, Mark, that's the life we chose to believe was normal. But it's not." Edward looked out his office window and saw Rosa in the yard, hanging clothes on the line while the twins crawled on the grass. The scene filled him with a peace he had never felt during his years of corporate success. "I wake up happy every day, Mark. Truly happy. Every client I serve, every house I renovate, every afternoon I spend with my family. It all has real meaning. I don't need anything else." "And Rosa, how is she adjusting?" Edward smiled at the question. "Rosa is thriving. She's studying to be a teacher, wants to work with kids. People here love her. She's made more friends in 6 months than I made in New York in 10 years. You don't miss anything, the life we had?" "I miss true friends like you, but I don't miss the rest of it." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Mark trying to understand Edward's transformation. When they hung up, Edward thought about the difference between the life he had before and the one he had now. In New York, he was Edward Montgomery, of Montgomery and Stevens Development. Here in Woodstock, he was just Edward, Rosa's husband, who was studying to be a teacher, the father of the twins who were always riding their bikes on the green. In the afternoon, after the pediatrician's appointment, where they learned that Isabella and Helena were developing perfectly, the family went to the Woodstock town green. It was a sunny Saturday in March, and the green was full of families enjoying the weekend. Edward watched Rosa playing with the twins in the sandbox, surrounded by other mothers who had become her friends. She laughed loudly, without a care for composure or social propriety. She was simply herself, and that was enough. "Mr. Edward," called Mrs. Miller, a 70-year-old woman who lived down the street. "How are these beautiful princesses?" Edward smiled. Mrs. Miller had adopted the family as if they were her own grandchildren, always bringing over homemade sweets or offering to help with the kids. "They're growing up too fast, Mrs. Miller. Soon they'll be running all over the place and giving me grey hair." "Oh, son, enjoy it while they're little. Before you know it, they grow up and want to see the world, forget all about their parents." As he was talking with Mrs. Miller, Edward saw a man approaching hesitantly. He didn't recognize him at first, but there was something familiar about him. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, "but aren't you Edward Montgomery, from Montgomery and Stevens Development?" Edward tensed for a moment. It was the first time in Woodstock that someone had recognized him from his previous life. "I was," Edward said cautiously. "I live here now." "I'm Rodrigo Garcia. My father was Juan Garcia. He was a mason on the Parkside Towers project back in New York. Do you remember him?" Edward vaguely remembered a mason who had worked on one of his sites a few years ago, but he didn't understand the connection. "My dad always said you were different from the other bosses," Rodrigo continued. "That you treated the workers with respect, that you cared about everyone's safety." "Your father was an excellent worker," Edward said, still not understanding where the conversation was going. "He passed away last year from a heart condition, but before he died he told me something I never forgot." Rodrigo paused for a moment, as if gathering the courage to continue. "When my mom got sick and needed an expensive surgery, you paid for the hospital. My dad never knew how to thank you. My mother's life was saved because of that." Edward vaguely recalled the case. There had been many employees over the years, many difficult situations where he had helped out financially. "I just wanted to thank you," Rodrigo said, his eyes filling with tears. "My mom lived for 5 more years because of your kindness. She saw her grandkids grow up. She saw me get married. You can't put a price on that." Edward was moved. He had completely forgotten about that episode, but for Rodrigo's family, it had been a life-changing moment. "When I heard you were living here, I wanted to come and thank you in person. It doesn't matter what happened with your company or why you came here. You're a good man, and that's what matters." After Rodrigo walked away, Edward thought about the encounter. Rosa approached, having sensed that something had happened. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked. Edward told her about the conversation with Rodrigo, and Rosa smiled with pride. "See? You were always a good man. Now you're just being good in a place where that's truly valued." That night, after the twins were asleep, Edward and Rosa sat on the porch watching the stars that shone much brighter than they ever did in New York. "Rosa," Edward said, "do you regret anything? Coming with you never? Even knowing everything we left behind?" Rosa turned to look at him. "Edward, do you want to know what I left behind? I left behind the feeling that I wasn't good enough. I left behind the fear of being judged for who I am. I left behind the loneliness of being just an invisible housekeeper." She took his hand in hers. "And what did I gain? I gained a man who loves me exactly as I am. I gained 2 daughters who call me Mom. I gained the chance to study, to have dreams, to build a future. I gained a real life." Edward kissed her forehead, feeling an immense gratitude for having had the courage to make the right choices. "And you?" Rosa asked. "Do you have any regrets?" "Never," Edward said without hesitation. "I traded a life of empty success for a life of real happiness. I traded social prestige for true love. I traded a cold mansion for a warm home." They sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the sounds of the country night, crickets chirping, the wind in the trees, the distant bark of a dog. "Edward," Rosa said softly, "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" Rosa smiled, her eyes sparkling, even in the dim light of the porch. "I'm pregnant." The world seemed to stop around Edward. "How? What? Are you sure?" "I took the test yesterday. and Dr. Fernanda confirmed it today when I took the girls for their checkup. Edward swept her up into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "We're having a baby," Edward said, still hardly believing the news. "We're having a baby," Rosa confirmed, and there was a pure joy in her voice that Edward would never forget. They kissed there on the porch, under the Vermont stars, knowing their family was about to grow even more. The twins would have a brother or sister, and this time Rosa would get to experience all of pregnancy and motherhood surrounded by love and support. Later that night, as Rosa slept beside him, Edward lay awake thinking about how unpredictable life was. A year ago, he was a desperate, widowed businessman with 2 daughters who couldn't find peace. Now he was a fulfilled man married to the woman he loved, father to 3 children and expecting a 4th. He had lost a fortune, a business empire, social status, and the admiration of an elite he had discovered to be superficial. But he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained happiness. In the next room, Isabella and Helena slept peacefully, wrapped in the sense of security and love that Rosa had brought into their lives since that first magical night. They would never remember the difficult first months, the endless crying or their father's despair. To them, Rosa would always be simply Mum, the woman who sang them to sleep and loved them unconditionally. Edward closed his eyes and fell asleep too, lulled by the quiet breathing of his family. Outside, Woodstock slept under the starry blanket of the country night, and in the small house on the quiet street, a family built by true love rested in peace. 6 months later, Rosa gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named John Peter, in honor of the son she had lost years before. Edward held his son in his arms for the first time, looking at Rosa, exhausted but radiant in the hospital bed, and knew he had made all the right decisions in his life. The twins, now a year and 3 months old, adored their little brother from the first moment. Isabella would spend hours watching John Peter sleep, while Helena tried to share her toys with the baby. They were a perfect, improbable family, united not by blood or convenience, but by the transformative power of true love. Edward never moved back to New York, though he occasionally visited Mark and other friends. With each visit, he felt more distant from that life, more grateful for having had the courage to leave it behind. Rosa graduated with a degree in education and opened a small preschool in Woodstock, specializing in caring for children with special needs. She never forgot her own losses and used that experience to help other families going through difficult times. The twins grew up in Woodstock, with a slight country accent, playing in the street with the other kids, raised with simple but solid values. They became hard-working young women, dedicated students, and above all, empathetic human beings who understood the real worth of people. John Peter grew up hearing the story of how his parents met, of how love had conquered all barriers and turned tragedy into happiness. He grew up knowing that true love recognizes no differences of class, color, or origin, and that the real wealth in life lies in genuine human connections. Edward grew old in Woodstock, building simple houses for simple people, but finding in each project a satisfaction he had never felt building skyscrapers in New York. He became respected in the community not for his bank account, but for his honesty and generosity. And every night Rosa still sang to her family before they went to sleep. It was the same lullaby that had calmed the twins on that first magical night, the song her grandmother had taught her, the song that spoke of love, loss, and renewal. It was the soundtrack of a life built on the most solid foundations possible: true love, the courage to make difficult choices, and the wisdom to know that happiness is not in what we accumulate, but in what we share. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward and Rosa has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of love that conquered all barriers, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest and truest side of the human soul, stories that show that true love still exists and can transform lives in unimaginable ways. We'll see you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions and renew your faith in the power of love.